12/21/24, Philae Island. The 21st of December is a very significant day. This is the winter solstice. It was also 1-2-2-1-2-4, which is a nice little number combination, maybe for later. I designed this trip for this day of the year to land on this day at the Temple of Isis on Philae Island. This is the longest night, and in this context, it reminds me of the long night of the 10-month pregnancy period, and it was appropriate to be here on the feminine rebirth. I took a small boat over and spent the day at the temple. The place isn't as popular as some of the more well-known sites. It's also a bit harder to get to, and they said tourism has been down since the Israel-Palestine conflict has taken center stage in the Grand Theater. There was almost no one present, so I sat in meditation at her temple alone. I typically wear headphones, so I'm not distracted by things going on, tour guides spewing the ever-changing consensus, so I can focus on what I'm doing. Also, people just think I'm autistic, so they leave me alone entirely. I said I focused on Isis and her maternal feminine, and other overlooked cliches like magic and rebirthing and regeneration. My focus here was to integrate into the ley lines of the planet, or the energy grid, or some people refer to it as the crystalline grid, whatever you want to refer to it as. Most all beliefs contain a variation of this idea within it, so it doesn't really much matter what we call it. The belief that we are microcosmic beings with these energy points. The planet also lives and has these energy points, and inside the solar system, as well as further on and so forth, and an infinite shot of a holographic image. The idea of as above, so below, and as within, so without is a concept as old as time, which no one person or faith can lay claim to. In any way, eternal truths like this, it doesn't really matter who or what coined the ideas. The Egyptians call the Nile River the cosmic mirror, saying that it mirrors the Milky Way in space. That's the same thing as above, so below. So is the Agdoad, but that's something to discuss entirely separately. The point is to not get entangled in sophistry or intellectual webs. Of these scenarios, I try to focus on corresponding energy centers with what I understand to be the nodes of the area. Sometimes I know or have a hunch, and sometimes I just open up and listen. I had a strange experience, perhaps I'll talk about somewhere else for brevity, but my focus, aside from resident energy activation, was to live inside the story of the old trinity. The old trinity was Isis, Osiris, and Horus, and it was the solstice after all. So in the meditation, I focused on the regeneration aspect of Isis regenerating Osiris after he was killed by Set and cut into pieces and thrown into River Nile. An unimportant side note, my mom named me Seth when I was born after the third son of Adam and Eve, as I was her third child, at least to my knowledge. However, things didn't work out as she planned, which is another story altogether, but my dad ended up naming me David, who slayed Goliath and became king of Israel. David played the harp and composed a lot of songs or psalms, but I'm good with either name, really. Anyway, in the legend, the bad brother called Set, I believe, is who Cain of Cain and Abel fame is modeled after. And I touch on that quite often in the music, but there are differences. In the biblical story, Seth is the third son of Adam and Eve and the spiritual child, unlike his very human and earthly, toiling, fighting brothers Cain and Abel. Admittedly, I haven't dove deep into the connections between the groups of brothers from Egypt to Hebrew, although there's the obvious connection, but that's not really the point here. After Set kills Osiris, his future old lady Isis, she is not letting this shit slide. She scours the lands, pieces Osiris back together, and that's why she stands for regeneration. She wraps Osiris in a cloth, like this is her guy, and they have a son, Horus. Anyway, the meditation was focusing on the regeneration of Osiris, one of my main guys here, and I was bringing that in for the coming year of regeneration and my new mission of healing and rebirthing on the solstice. A lot of my focus was on things specific to my own life, so I won't dive too much into that, but in my own reenactment, we regenerated Osiris at the temple. The temple, which was also a very long-standing pagan temple before the Christian bloodbath that was to come, but even if it weren't, the island surrounded by water is an obvious earth worship center. Even if you're not pagan, just being in awe at nature is good enough, which is why a lot of us dream of islands in the sun. Perhaps it could be worth diving into later that pagan simply means country dweller. Country dweller was meant as an insult by the sophisticated city folks, for example, the folks of Athens. We'll use Athens because the temple here is Greek in origin. However, it's a bit funny that every Greek intellectual, without exception, took sojourns to the country amongst the pagans and away from the city for enlightenment. Perhaps this is a thread for another time. I'll only note that not much has changed today, and with the city-dwelling Ivy League intelligentsia looking down their noses at the country dwellers, aka the pagans. I took a few pictures with my phone and took the boat to the island just next door in the Nile where I was staying with my Nubian pals. It was afternoon, the sun was starting to go down, so I went into the Nile and just laid in the water, floating, not swimming, just floating, and it was freezing. And also, it wasn't a swimming area, but this was important again to reenact the water, the birthing water of Horus. So Isis and Osiris, who are husband and wife and brother and sister, which people think is weird, but I guess they don't think that Adam and Eve are also divine brother and sister and husband and wife. They have Horus, and it is a virgin birth because the only part of Osiris that Isis doesn't recover before reassembling him was the phallus, so that symbolizes the virgin birth, which our city dwellers of today say has to be a myth because there's no such thing as a virgin birth of a man, which seems quite simple compared to their ruling belief that the universe entirely was a virgin birth from absolutely nothing, but I'm sure they'll tell you how they know something I don't. Anyway, Horus is supposed to grow up and kill his evil uncle Set to avenge Osiris for his mother. This is overtaking of the father or the rescuing of, and usually taking his place in every hero's journey mythology. So the floating in the river was the water of birth, and that was focusing in on the energy of Horus, and that was brief floating in the birth canal, which was the Nile, which brought life to all the area for all the time that we know of. Then I came out of the crocodile water and went up into the mountain. This was, again, the hero's journey of Horus. I sat on the tallest rock and focused in on the mission for the year, the conquest of killing off Set, the old self, the regeneration, the shedding of skin, burning away type of thing. I sat up there maybe an hour, although I wasn't much in the body. Rather, I was projected high above the body, which sat on the rock. I flew around Horus style. I saw profound pink and purple. I don't even know what to call them. They weren't images or pictures with the eye. It was eyes closed, images drawn and feeling. The strange thing about it was, as I flew around, my vision was perfect. I could see all the things below as far as I flew. I flew over a road where I saw some sort of vultures scattered around on the ground, and I could see them like I had the eyes of an eagle. I had an immediate understanding that we were the same species, and I looked down on them not like they were lower than me, but like they had made separate choices in life. So they couldn't fly as I did and hunt as I do, and they surely didn't look as glorious. The idea didn't really come from my own mind. It came over me entirely unsolicited. Anyway, I was perfectly able to see and felt warm and fine, but when I came back to and opened my David eyes, it was pitch black and dark and cold. When the sun went down, I took a few notes on the stars. The star of Sirius, which is the star of Isis, was unbelievably bright, and so was Venus on this night, of course. But you could see several planets with the eye, like Mars. That was very obvious as well, but Orion was glowing specifically. At this point, I was Horus, ready to hit my mission. One of the reasons I stayed on the island was just across the way, about a kilometer maybe, was the location of Philae before they moved it to the next island. I believe because it was not sinking, but the dam caused the water to rise. So I walked over, which was very difficult. I would say I regretted it, but it almost added to the hero's journey of navigating the huge, sharp piles of rocks in the pitch black to the other side of the island. I got to the old location, and there are a set of old temple doors still there. I'll have to put some pictures in because I didn't take any because it was pitch black and I wasn't really playing with the phone. I could hardly see. But as part of the reenactment with the gateway doors that still stand, I sat and had a brief meditation type of tap-in. After sitting a while, I went back to my room. I got online and looked up a couple things, investigative things that were on my mind. I wasn't really looking for verification or validation, but I was just curious about the things that I had seen when I was flying above my body earlier during the meditation. I'd been thinking about the eagle and the vulture and the feeling that I had during the meditation and how I understood us to be the same, so I started looking things up that I didn't prior know. I found out or learned or found out or whatever that the eagle and what they call the old hawk and vulture belong to the same family of species. It's pronounced something like, I will probably mess up, but it's Occipitridae, something like that, which I had no knowledge of or interest. I never thought it, but it seems obvious because they look nearly identical. Their habits are pretty much the only difference as far as one preying and one being a scavenger have resulted in two very different birds, which I thought about that for a while and thought about how it might pertain to humans. During my thinking, I had to wrestle with the search engine, which continuously tried to mislead me. First, it tried to convince me that eagle beaks and talons were hard and sharp and vultures were soft and weak. When I asked it if it knew how hard an eagle beak was in comparison to a vulture beak, it said that maybe it wasn't harder, but the harpy eagle has a bite strength of 600 pounds of pressure per square inch. Then when I said that a harpy's bite strength is twice of what a bald eagle is, and probably the strongest eagle bite strength that there is, we don't call the bald eagle a vulture. And then it started wiggling again, talking about how they could dive at 200 miles an hour. Then when I mentioned that that was true, but a vulture can fly for much longer than an eagle can soar, it wiggled like it was a U.S. politician at the keyboard spinning live narratives for me. It was really strange, actually. I wanted to investigate my vision, but then I realized I should just keep my visions to myself and stay offline where even bird species are being propagandized. I did another longer meditation, maybe 2 hours, and then slept to live my first day in the morning as Horus at his two temples at Kamombo and Edfu. My sketch on this day was a crude drawing of the process I described, which is the regeneration of Osiris, the birthing of Horus through the canal depicted as the Nile, and then the climbing of the mountain and entering through the old temple doors into the quest, or the coming year, anew. Musically, I knocked out another 2 or 3 songs on this day. The juices were flowing, or beginning to flow, for the K6 project, which will be quite ambitious. K6, K7, and K8 will have 9 songs apiece. That will be the 999 for the 2025, which is a 9. But I don't mean to dive into the discussions of gematria because I'm starting to get tired. To be clear, the project doesn't have much to do specifically about me being in Egypt, but of course it has everything to do with it. In fact, I've been wanting to do this dive for quite some time. I visited Egypt before in the past, just as a tourist, but it wasn't until I finished the last story, as I discussed in the last entry, until I could dive in and begin the work that is happening now. As the last bits of the story come out and are framed and packaged, I begin moving ahead on the next piece of work. Having 3 LPs come in a year while trying to get the other 2 final EPs out and into the world is a good task, but I'll have to stay up late nights for. I'm afraid I'll have to neglect a lot of the work I do in my sleep for the work that I do awake, but that's okay. I had a look at the stars for agreeable release dates of the trinity of LPs this year, and they will be recorded on the March equinox, the June solstice, and the September equinox. They will release very soon after, as I already have the artwork for the records done. The artwork piece I drew when I was 20 years old, and I've just found that ancient sketch laying around, and it makes all sense now that it was just sitting there waiting for this idea. I have to get the art together for all three and have it kind of prepped and waiting to drop in the songs and get it pressed as soon as possible before the next one starts coming the 3 months after. The record will be called Rust Belt Nu Metal 1, 2, and 3. The overarching theme is a real nu metal music coming alive out of the long-abandoned blue-collar Rust Belt Midwest. 27 good songs are in order, so I have to finish about 9 a week before I fly home, which is agreeable. It is really curious to consider the experience of studio recording in front of an audience, mulling over logistics and specialty things we may need to put in place to facilitate this. Anyway, let me get out of this book now.